We must produce 50,000 planes a year.
The 16th of May, 1940, Tokyo Imperial Navy Ministry. The conference room was filled with the sharp scent of tobacco and the rustle of silk uniforms when the announcement from Washington arrived. President Franklin Roosevelt had stood before Congress and demanded that America prepare to produce 5,000 airplanes a year. The words echoed like thunder across the Pacific, but in this chamber of admirals and ministers, they provoked only laughter. Japan's leaders, already intoxicated by victories in China, scoffed at the declaration. How could a nation of consumers obsessed with cars and radios ever transform into a war machine? To them, it sounded like a bluff, a desperate boast from a distant president who had never known true war. Admiral Osamu Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, dismissed the report with a wave of his hand. He spoke with icy confidence, declaring that the Americans lacked the discipline, the bloodline, and the spirit of sacrifice that Japan's warriors carried into battle. In his voice was arrogance, but also the blindness of conviction. No one in the room doubted him. They believed the factories of Detroit could never rival the forges of Nippon, nor could women and immigrants hammer out machines of war with the precision of Japanese craftsmen. Yet beneath the surface of their mockery lay a dangerous miscalculation. For what Roosevelt envisioned was not a dream, but the opening shot of an industrial revolution that would soon redraw the map of power. If Japan's admirals were right, America would stumble and collapse under its own promises. But if they were wrong, then every ship, every island, and every soldier of the empire stood on borrowed time. The laughter that rang through the Imperial Navy Ministry on the 16th of May, 1940, did not fade quickly. It became an echo carried into every strategy, meeting every war council, a certainty repeated so often that it hardened into dogma. Roosevelt's thunderous declaration that America would produce 5,000 airplanes a year was brushed aside as empty rhetoric, the bluff of a leader desperate to inspire a nation that had never known invasion, never bled on its own soil. For the Japanese High Command, the idea that Detroit's car factories and Chicago's assembly lines could be turned into arsenals of war was not only unbelievable, it was insulting. At that moment, Japan was ascendant. Victories across China had swelled the empire's pride, and the looming campaigns in Southeast Asia promised even greater riches of oil, rubber, and steel. Reports arriving from the front described swift conquests, towns falling in days, enemy forces scattered before the discipline of the Imperial Army. This success fed the conviction that Japan's warriors embodied a spirit no democracy could match. Against such zeal, against such sacrifice, what could soft, indulgent Americans muster? The generals and admirals believed the United States was a giant of consumption, not of war. The prejudice went deeper than strategy. It was racial, cultural, and ideological. Intelligence officers who had studied American industry sent back warnings reports of massive automotive plants with potential for retooling statistics on steel and aluminum output that dwarfed Japan's capacity. But these documents were read with disdain. How could a society built on individual comfort, where women shopped in department stores and men measured success in stock dividends, possibly endure the discipline required for a total war? To the Japanese elite, America was an empire of stanchions. Illusions its wealth, a mask for weakness. They saw jazz clubs, baseball games, and Hollywood films, and mistook them for evidence of decay. Admiral Nagano himself, in private conversation with younger officers, described America as a country of merchants, not warriors. He pointed to the consumer goods flooding the global market, cars, radios, typewriters, and insisted that such luxuries softened a people. Soldiers raised in plenty would never bear hunger, never accept the silence of sacrifice, never charge into certain death with the composure of a samurai. That assumption became doctrine repeated until no one dared question it. And yet, even within Tokyo, voices of caution persisted. A handful of attachés who had visited American factories returned uneasy. They spoke of endless assembly lines stretching further than the eye could see, of machinery so modern it seemed alien, of industrial towns where entire populations were trained to work in rhythm with machines. In December 1939, one such officer remarked that if America ever awakened, its capacity would surpass imagination. But his words were drowned in the chorus of arrogance. Reports that women were already appearing in workshops, learning the skills of riveting and inspection, were mocked as signs of desperation. A nation that needed its women to work, the Japanese insisted, had already admitted defeat. The irony was cruel. What Tokyo dismissed as weakness would become America's greatest strength. But in 1940, that future was hidden. Japan's leaders basked in the glow of their victories. The Chinese front seemed endless, a stage on which Japan's soldiers proved daily their superiority over poorly equipped foes. In Southeast Asia, British and Dutch colonies looked fragile, their defenses neglected. America, for all its size, seemed hesitant, trapped in isolationism, unwilling to shed blood for foreign soil. From Tokyo's perspective, Roosevelt's speech was nothing more than an attempt to rattle sabers to frighten Japan into retreat. The contempt was not only strategic but personal. Japanese newspapers ridiculed Roosevelt, portraying him as a crippled politician clinging to impossible promises. Cartoons mocked American workers as lazy and clumsy, incapable of mastering the precision of aircraft construction. Behind closed doors, senior officers whispered that the United States would collapse under the weight of its own materialism long before producing even a fraction of the aircraft Roosevelt demanded. The phrase 50000 airplanes became a kind of joke, repeated with smirks, the punchline to every discussion of American weakness. This arrogance carried a dangerous consequence. It blinded the empire at the very moment when clarity was most needed. Intelligence cables from Washington describing American mobilization were dismissed as exaggerations. Reports of factories shifting to triple shifts were laughed off as propaganda. Even when charts showed American steel output exceeding Japan's by more than tenfold, the numbers were explained away as irrelevant. What mattered, they argued, was not material but spirit. And in spirit, they believed Japan was unchallenged. The link to Roosevelt's announcement was clear. Where America saw a challenge, Japan saw a comedy. Where Roosevelt planted the seeds of transformation, Tokyo burned those seeds in the furnace of arrogance. And so the empire marched forward, convinced that the Pacific would bend to its will, that Pearl Harbor would crush American resolve, that no nation of comfort could endure a war of attrition. But history had already begun to move in another direction. The very contempt that filled the ministry's chamber on that May morning would become the foundation of future despair. For as the months passed, America did not collapse. It stirred. It organized. It began to retool its factories and train its workforce. And every hour, every rivet driven, every wing assembled, brought Roosevelt's prophecy closer to reality. Japan, blinded by its pride, could not see it. They had dismissed a storm as a breeze. They had mocked an awakening giant as a fool. And in that miscalculation lay the seeds of their undoing. By the time the empire would realize its mistake, the sky over the Pacific would be filled with swarms of American aircraft, thousands upon thousands, rising from factories Japan never believed could exist, built by hands they had dismissed, driven by a resolve they thought impossible. The laughter of May 1940 would in the end echo as the prelude to silence. The arrogance that filled Tokyo's naval chambers in May 1940 stood in stark contrast to the reality unfolding on the other side of the Pacific. While Japanese admirals laughed at Roosevelt's promise, America was confronting an uncomfortable truth. Its military aviation strength was pitiful. At the dawn of 1939, the Army Air Corps had fewer than 1700 combat aircraft, many of them obsolete biplanes. The entire nation had produced only 3611 military aircraft that year, a fraction of what Roosevelt now demanded. To Japan, those numbers were confirmation of weakness. But to Roosevelt, they were a challenge, a line in the sand that would test whether America's industrial heart could be transformed into an engine of war. The president knew that speeches alone could not conjure airplanes. He needed a man who understood factories the way generals understood battlefields. Someone who could look at an assembly line and see not cars or refrigerators, but squadrons of bombers and fighters. That man was William Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who had risen through the ranks to become president of General Motors. Knudsen embodied the very spirit Japan dismissed: an outsider, a worker turned executive, a believer in mass production. When Roosevelt called Knudsen left behind his $300,000 salary, and accepted a symbolic wage of $1 per year. For him, the fight was not about profit. It was about proving what American industry could do. Knudsen entered Washington like a whirlwind. He walked into a government long accustomed to slow procurement and cautious planning, and told them bluntly, if you want 5,000 planes, you must build like Detroit. He brought with him the ruthless efficiency of the automotive world, breaking down designs into subassemblies, creating specialized tooling, and demanding precision that could be replicated thousands of times over. Where military planners saw impossibility, Knudsen saw opportunity. Yet even within America, skepticism was thick. Congressmen doubted the figures, generals muttered about impossible timetables, and businessmen feared financial ruin. In 1940, with war still distant to many Americans, the idea of transforming the nation's factories into a war machine seemed like madness. Detroit was built to produce Chevrolets and Buicks, not bombers. The riveters and machinists knew how to craft fenders and crankshafts, not wings and fuselages. But Knudsen's genius was not in knowing how to build airplanes. It was in knowing how to build anything at scale with relentless repetition until volume itself became power. Factories began to hum with new life. At first, it was awkward and inefficient. Workers accustomed to stamping car doors found themselves staring at aluminum alloys and complicated blueprints. Entire assembly lines had to be redesigned tools, re-engineered managers, retrained. Mistakes where common parts failed, inspection and whole aircraft had to be rebuilt. Critics sneered, whispering that Roosevelt's proclamation would collapse under its own weight. But Knudsen refused to flinch. He told his engineers that the learning curve was not a failure but a process, that every rivet driven wrong today was one less rivet wasted tomorrow. This was the hidden truth the Japanese could not see. While Tokyo clung to its illusion of superiority, America was grinding through the painful birth of transformation. Behind factory doors in Detroit, Seattle, and California, a new rhythm was taking shape. One that echoed not the chaos of improvisation, but the steady drumbeat of industrial war. By the end of 1941, only 18 months after Roosevelt's challenge, American factories were producing more than 2,000 aircraft per month, a 20-fold increase from the dark days of 1939. Knudsen was not alone. He assembled a team of titans, Henry Ford, Charles Sorensen, Donald Douglas, and countless others who brought their company's resources into the fight. The Ford Motor Company announced the construction of Willow Run, a bomber plant so vast it would become the largest factory under one roof in the world. Boeing expanded its facilities in Seattle to meet the demand for the B-17 Flying Fortress. Douglas Aircraft hired thousands, training them overnight to rivet, weld, and inspect with military precision. Each new project carried risk, and every delay was ammunition for skeptics. Yet the momentum was undeniable. America was not stumbling, it was awakening. The contrast with Japan could not have been sharper. In Tokyo, leaders convinced themselves that America's consumer culture could never endure sacrifice. But in Detroit, men and women were working double shifts, sleeping on factory floors, driven by a sense that history itself was being forged on the assembly line. To them, Roosevelt's words were not propaganda, but prophecy. If Japan believed the United States incapable of total war, it was because they had never witnessed a democracy mobilized. The first fruits of this mobilization appeared slowly, almost invisibly. A handful of new squadrons equipped with modern fighters, a trickle of bombers rolling off lines that had once built sedans. But beneath the surface, the storm was building. Tooling, improved processes, streamlined efficiency, sharpened. Each failure became a lesson, each redesign a step closer to mastery. By the time Pearl Harbor burned in December 1941, America's factories were already shifting into overdrive. The giant Japan had mocked was beginning to stir in earnest, and every hour brought it closer to full strength. Knudsen himself described the transformation as a miracle of repetition. Where once a factory worker might build one engine a day, he now built 10. Where once a car plant might produce thousands of vehicles a month, it now produced fighters with wings strong enough to carry machine guns across oceans. The miracle was not that America built airplanes, it was that it learned to build them as easily as it once built automobiles. This was the unseen danger Japan had unleashed by dismissing Roosevelt's words. In ridiculing America's potential, they had blinded themselves to the slow but unstoppable march of industrial mobilization. Each day that passed, the gap widened. Each bomber completed, each fighter tested, each assembly line perfected, brought Roosevelt's impossible promise closer to reality. What Tokyo's admirals could not fathom was that this transformation was not temporary, not fragile, not desperate. It was systemic, a permanent shift in how America viewed its role in the world. While Japan celebrated its victories across Asia, the United States was constructing not just planes but an arsenal capable of sustaining war on two oceans at once. The laughter of 1,940 was still ringing in Tokyo's ears, but across the Pacific, a new sound was rising. The clatter of rivet guns, the thunder of stamping presses, the roar of engines tested for the first time. It was the sound of an industrial colossus, awakening a force that would soon sweep across the Pacific skies. In the space between arrogance and reality lay the seeds of Japan's undoing. What they dismissed as propaganda was in fact the blueprint of their defeat. And as Roosevelt's impossible dream became Knudsen's relentless mission, the balance of power was already shifting. Japan had mistaken silence for weakness. But in America's silence, a storm was gathering. The transformation that William Knudsen and Roosevelt had set in motion was still fragile in its early days. But by 1942, it began to take on a shape so massive, so audacious, that it defied imagination. What had once been whispers of possibility became the roar of engines, the pounding of hammers, and the endless hiss of rivet guns echoing across the American heartland. This was not just production. It was the birth of a war machine, a network of factories so vast and so relentless that it would answer every doubt, every sneer, every arrogant dismissal Tokyo had thrown at Roosevelt's proclamation. The crown jewel of this awakening was Willow Run. Built on farmland in Ypsilanti, Michigan, the Ford Motor Company promised a miracle, a factory that would assemble a four-engine B-24 Liberator bomber, not in weeks, but in hours. When construction began in April 1941, skeptics scoffed. How could a plant designed by men who had once built Model Ts possibly master the complexity of a bomber with nearly 500,000 parts? At first, the critics seemed right. The first B-24 to roll off the line in September 1942 had to be completely rebuilt. Quality control was a nightmare. Defects soared to nearly 50%, and production sputtered at a humiliating 56 bombers per month. The press derided it as "Will it run?" But the men and women at Willow Run refused to let failure be the final word. Engineers broke down the monstrous complexity of the B-24 into manageable subassemblies. They invented hydraulic riveting machines to increase precision, standardized wiring harnesses to cut time, and reorganize the line into a moving river of parts and labor. Every mistake became an innovation. Every delay became fuel for improvement. Slowly, the plant that had been mocked began to surge. By September 1943, Willow Run was producing 148 bombers a month. By December, 365. And then came the breakthrough of April 1944, when Willow Run shattered all expectations and turned out 428 Liberators in 1 month. One bomber every 63 minutes, day and night. The scale was staggering. This single plant produced more bombers than the entire Japanese aircraft industry combined. Tokyo's dismissive laughter from 1,940 now rang hollow-drowned beneath the thunder of bombers streaming into the skies. What had been called impossible was now routine. America had not only caught up, it had surpassed every measure of comparison. Willow Run was not alone. Boeing's Seattle plant expanded into a colossus of steel and glass, where rows of B-17 flying fortresses rolled out daily, their noses gleaming with gun turrets, their bellies filled with the promise of destruction for enemy cities. and fleets. In California, Douglas Aircraft grew from a modest company of 68 employees in 1936 to a sprawling empire of 16,700 workers by 1944. Women in coveralls stood shoulder to shoulder with men, their hands guiding rivets into place with a precision that astonished inspectors. North American Aviation's lines turned out 500 P-51 Mustangs a month, sleek fighters that would one day escort bombers all the way to Tokyo's doorstep. Lockheed's engineers, once known for their elegant designs, now churned out a P-38, Lightning every 90 minutes, adapting to more than 2,000 combat-driven modifications without halting production. What made these achievements even more devastating to Japan was the sheer speed of growth. In 1940, America had built fewer than 4,000 military aircraft. By 1943, it was producing more than 85 0-inches a single year. In 1944, the peak American factories turned out nearly 1,000 aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports, while Japan struggled to produce a fraction of that number. Each month of delay for Willow Run or Boeing had been a battlefield lost, but each breakthrough became a battlefield won. For Japan, the comparison was catastrophic. Its aircraft plants, already strained by shortages of aluminum and steel, could never match the scale. Bombing raids across the Pacific crippled production lines that were already too small to meet demand. Engineers complained of lack of materials managers, of constant sabotage by forced labor, and pilots of machines rushed into combat with defects uncorrected. By contrast, America's system thrived on adaptation. When combat revealed weaknesses in the B-17 against frontal attacks, Boeing added chin turrets within 60 days. When long-range operations demanded modified B-24 seconds, Consolidated adapted immediately without slowing production. Japanese modifications, strangled by bureaucracy and shortages, took months or even years. The numbers told the story more brutally than words ever could. By 1944, America was producing more planes each month than Japan could in an entire year. Each Liberator, rolling off Willow Run's endless line, was not just an aircraft. It was a verdict, a mechanical declaration that Roosevelt's prophecy had been fulfilled. And yet the factories were more than statistics. They were living monuments to a mobilized democracy. At Douglas Long Beach, women inspectors reduced defect rates from over 3% to less than 0.5%. At Willow Run, Rosie the Riveter herself, Rose Will, Monroe drove thousands of rivets per shift with near-perfect accuracy. Ford engineers redesigned tools to fit smaller hands, and by doing so, improved efficiency for everyone. The workers were not slaves forced to labor under whips, but free citizens who bought war bonds with their own wages, financing the very aircraft they were building. This was the answer to Tokyo's arrogance. The laughter of 1,940 had been silenced by the roar of engines rolling out of factories that never slept. The empire that had dismissed America as soft and decadent was now staring down the reality of a nation that had transformed its consumer factories into arsenals of annihilation. The link back to Roosevelt's challenge was clear. What Japan had once considered a joke was now a nightmare. An endless stream of bombers and fighters swarming across skies that had once belonged to the rising Sunday. Each new factory, each new assembly line was a reminder that Japan's contempt had been the seed of its own undoing. By the time the war reached its climax in 1943 and 1944, America's industrial engine was not just answering the call, it was overwhelming the battlefield with sheer abundance. Willow Run, Boeing Douglas, North American Lockheed, each name became synonymous with inevitability. The empire that had laughed at 5,000 planes now faced a reality it could never escape. America had not only met Roosevelt's impossible demand, it had doubled it. And the echo of those factories, the endless thrum of production, was the sound of Japan's fate being sealed. The thunder of Willow Run and the endless roar from Boeing's lines were more than feats of engineering. They were the sound of a society mobilizing in a way Japan could never imagine. America's factories did not run on the backs of shackled workers or prisoners driven by fear. They ran on the hands of free citizens, diverse and determined, each carrying their own story into the war effort. This was the secret Tokyo could not comprehend. Japan had believed spirit alone gave it superiority, yet it was America's spirit channeled through democracy, inclusion, and voluntary sacrifice that made its production not just vast, but unstoppable. Women were at the heart of this transformation. In 1941, they made up less than 1% of the aircraft workforce. By 1943, they were the majority. At Douglas's Long Beach plant, over half of the 41000 employees were women. They drove rivets, wired instruments, inspected engines with eyes so sharp they cut defect rates to a fraction of their former levels. The figure of Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda, it was reality. At Willow Run, Will Monroe herself worked shift after shift, hammering thousands of rivets with accuracy exceeding 99%. Factories adapted tools to fit smaller hands, designed lighter pneumatic drills to reduce fatigue, and discovered that efficiency soared. What Tokyo dismissed as desperation, the sight of women in coveralls, was in fact the dawn of a new strength. It was not just women. African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, immigrants from Europe and Asia, all entered the industrial ranks. For many, it was the first time they had been given a chance to work alongside others as equals. The war opened doors closed for generations. Black workers who had been barred from skilled positions now became welders, machinists, and inspectors. In segregated America, they still faced discrimination, but the sheer need for labor forced change. Their hands built wings and engines that would darken the skies over Tokyo itself. Japanese leaders who dismissed these communities as weak or inferior had no idea that their labor would become a decisive factor in burying the empire's ambitions. Even teenagers and the elderly joined the effort. High school boys left classrooms to operate lathes. Retired craftsmen returned to teach new workers the precision of metalwork. Disabled workers were given stations where their skills could shine, assembling wiring, calibrating instruments, performing tasks requiring steady focus rather than brute strength. In a democracy at war, no one was useless. Every hand, every hour, every rivet was counted. Japan's system could not have been more different. While America's factories thrived on diversity and voluntary unity, Japan turned increasingly to forced labor. From Korea, China, and Southeast Asia, tens of thousands of men and women were dragged into mines and workshops. They worked under brutal conditions, half-starved, beaten for the slightest error. In underground facilities where Japan attempted to disperse production, tens of thousands of prisoners perished in the dark, their labor producing as many defects as planes. Sabotage was rampant. Engines were deliberately misassembled, bolts left loose, wiring cut. The whip could force hands to move, but it could not force quality, and Japan paid the price. Where American factories reduced defects year after year, Japanese plants collapsed into inefficiency and despair. The difference was not simply moral. It was practical, measurable, undeniable. Democratic mobilization created a feedback loop of improvement. A woman riveter who noticed a flaw could suggest a change, and that change could reach engineers within days. A worker on a line could propose a faster method, and management listened because every idea counted. Innovation flowed from bottom to top, from worker to executive, and then back into production. In Japan, where hierarchy suffocated initiative, such a system was unthinkable. Orders flowed downward, mistakes were hidden, innovations smothered. The result was staggering. American production did not only multiply, it refined itself constantly. Planes rolled off the lines, faster, stronger, more reliable. When combat revealed flaws, the fixes arrived on the next batch of aircraft. By contrast, Japanese aircraft often entered combat already flawed, plagued by shortages of materials and errors from overworked, underfed laborers. This was the answer to the arrogance of 1940. Japan had believed a democracy could not endure hardship. Yet it was precisely the freedom to choose, the willingness of citizens to volunteer, that unleashed an energy Japan's authoritarian system could never summon. Americans bought war bonds with their own wages, literally financing the bombers they built. They worked nights and weekends, not under threat, but out of conviction that their labor was part of the fight. A free worker with a purpose outproduced 10 slaves with a whip at their back. By 1944, the statistics spoke for themselves. Over 310,000 women worked in aircraft production. More than 2 million Americans in total labored in the aviation industry. They came from every background, every color, every creed. Together they built nearly 100,000 planes in a single year, more than the Empire of Japan managed during the entire war. Each plane carried not only steel and aluminum, but the proof that democracy's inclusiveness was a weapon more powerful than tyranny's cruelty. The connection to the factories was direct. Willow Run did not become a miracle because of Henry Ford alone. It became a miracle because thousands of women and men, many of whom had never seen an airplane before, came together and learned to build one every hour. Boeing's assembly lines did not thunder because executives demanded it, but because immigrants and citizens alike stood shoulder to shoulder believing that their work would decide the fate of nations. This was why America did not merely surpass Japan in numbers. It surpassed in quality, in resilience, in adaptability. The empire that had sneered at Roosevelt's 50,000 plane dream now faced not only an avalanche of machines, but an industrial culture that improved itself daily. Japan's reliance on forced labor created collapse. America's reliance on free people created momentum. The arrogance of 1940 had blinded Tokyo to this truth. They saw women in factories and thought of weakness. They saw minorities on the line and thought of inferiority. They saw a democracy filled with debate and believed it meant division. But the truth was that America's democracy turned its differences into unity, its diversity into strength. Each rivet, each wing, each engine carried not only material power, but the weight of a principle that free societies, when threatened, can rise together in ways no dictatorship can ever match. By the time Japan realized this, it was too late. The skies were filled with squadrons of American planes built by hands they had dismissed, driven by spirits they had mocked. The empire's contempt had become its downfall, because it could not grasp that democracy's mobilization was not weakness. It was the ultimate strength. The power of America's mobilized society forged in the factories of Willow Run and Boeing was not an abstract achievement. It had direct, devastating consequences on the battlefields and skies of the Pacific. By 1942, the war that Tokyo believed would be decided by samurai spirit and surprise attacks had shifted into a struggle of attrition, and in that struggle, America's industrial avalanche became the decisive weapon. The contrast between democratic mobilization and authoritarian exploitation was no longer a theory, it was playing out in the blood and fire of the Pacific. The first shock came at Midway. In June 1942, Japan sent 4 of its best carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, to crush what remained of the American fleet. But American factories had already begun to replace losses with alarming speed. New aircraft poured into Hawaiian bases, and pilots trained on machines Japan believed could not possibly be built in such numbers. When the battle ended, 4 Japanese carriers lay burning, their crews lost, their air wings shattered. For Tokyo, it was a crippling blow. For America, it was only the beginning. Where Japan struggled to replace a single carrier, America was already laying keels for a dozen more. From that moment onward, the pattern was set. Every clash revealed the same truth: America could afford to lose, and Japan could not. At Guadalcanal in late 1942, American Marines fought month after month with tenuous supply lines, yet behind them stood the endless production of Liberty ships and transports aircraft replacements arriving weekly. Japanese pilots, once the terror of the Pacific, began to notice the difference. A downed Zero meant months before another could take its place. A downed Wildcat or Hellcat was replaced within days. The arithmetic of war had turned cruel. By 1943, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. In the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, waves of American bombers filled the skies. Japanese veterans who had once enjoyed superiority now faced overwhelming numbers. The phrase passed quietly among pilots: "For every one we shoot down, 10 more arrive." It was not exaggeration, but reality. America's factories were spitting out thousands of fighters each month, while Japan's production, hamstrung by shortages, sabotage, and bombing raids, fell further and further behind. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, what history would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was the ultimate expression of this disparity. Japan launched hundreds of aircraft in a desperate attempt to stop the American advance. Nearly all were destroyed. Pilots, many barely trained due to shortages of fuel and instructors, were slaughtered against swarms of Hellcats. American losses were minimal and replacements were already en route before the battle had even ended. Japanese admirals stared at the carnage and realized the awful truth: they no longer had an air force. Then came Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. Here, the full weight of American production bore down. Carriers stretched to the horizon, their decks crowded with aircraft. Battleships and cruisers, many newly built, lined the seas. Behind them surged transports and supply ships, evidence of a logistics machine Japan could never match. In the sky, American aircraft attacked relentlessly, wave after wave, each raid seeming larger than the last. Japanese commanders threw everything they had: surface fleets, kamikaze pilots, what remained of their air arm. But the tide was unstoppable. America had more planes, more ships, more everything, and it could replace losses instantly. For Japanese pilots, the despair was personal. One ace described flying against an American bomber formation in 1944. "We attacked, but their numbers stretched from horizon to horizon. We were 8 fighters against hundreds. It was hopeless." Another, after surviving the Turkey Shoot, confessed that training new pilots was meaningless. They send boys to fight men, and even if one survives, the Americans have 10 more. The exhaustion in their voices echoed the exhaustion of an empire that could no longer sustain the war it had begun. Meanwhile, American commanders grasped what Tokyo had feared to admit. They could plan offensives, knowing that production would cover any loss. Bombers could be sent deep into enemy territory, escorted by fighters in numbers unthinkable only a year before. If a squadron was wiped out, another waited in reserve. If a carrier was damaged, shipyards already had replacements on the way. This confidence transformed strategy. The United States could take risks, strike boldly, and press forward without fear of collapse. Japan, by contrast, had to guard every asset, knowing each loss was irreplaceable. The numbers by 1944 told the story of inevitability. America built nearly 100,000 aircraft that year alone, more than Japan had produced in the entire war. Every month, thousands of new machines filled Pacific airfields, while Japan struggled to build hundreds. For every bomber squadron destroyed over Tokyo, another was already forming in California. For every fleet engagement, American shipyards poured forth new vessels, their steel hulls gleaming as they slid into the water. The empire's gamble that America lacked the will or capacity to fight had collapsed in the face of this industrial hurricane. This was the culmination of the journey that began with laughter in Tokyo in 1940. What Japan had dismissed as fantasy had become its doom. Roosevelt's impossible dream, Knudsen's relentless engineering, Willow Run's roaring assembly lines, the mobilization of women and minorities, all of it came together in a storm of aircraft and ships that swept across the Pacific. Japan had believed spirit alone would win wars, but spirit without supply, courage without replacements, sacrifice without reinforcement, it all turned to ash against the weight of American production. By the final months of 1944, the empire stood on the brink. Its cities burned under bomber raids, its fleets shattered, its skies empty. Kamikazes, desperate young men hurled into death, were not a sign of strength but of exhaustion. Every mission they flew was proof of what had been lost: the ability to fight on equal terms against an enemy that could replace everything. Japan could replace nothing. The link back to that first moment of arrogance was unbroken. The laughter of 1940 had become the silence of 1944, a silence broken only by the thunder of American bombers overhead. Japan had gambled on contempt and lost to reality. The strategic consequences were clear. The Pacific was no longer Japan's ocean. It belonged to the arsenal of democracy, to the factories that never slept, to the free people who had built an empire of steel and aluminum across the skies. This was not merely victory, it was inevitability. And it was the final step on the path from arrogance to recognition, from contempt to defeat. The empire that had dismissed Roosevelt's words now stood buried beneath them, crushed by the very production miracle it had refused to believe. In the end, Japan's laughter in 1940 became the echo of its downfall. What began as scorn for Roosevelt's words ended with the skies over Tokyo filled with swarms of American bombers, each one born from factories Japan believed could never exist. The empire that trusted spirit alone to triumph was buried under steel, aluminum, and the resolve of a free people who turned diversity into strength. The lesson was unmistakable. In total war, contempt is fatal. America's arsenal of democracy proved that production lines could be as decisive as front lines, and Japan learned it too late.